When the surprise witness entered the courtroom, my wife and her lawyer turned pale. The figure who slowly walked to the witness stand was Claudia, my brother, Marco's wife. Seeing her there, pale but determined, was like seeing a ghost. Lara, my wife, turned to me with wide eyes, a silent question I couldn't answer at that moment. Our lawyer, a man named Victor, who until then had maintained steely calm, seemed to have lost his footing. He straightened the papers on the table, but his hands were shaking a little. I was the only one at our table who wasn't surprised. In fact, I was counting on that moment. The shock on everyone's faces was the first part of my revenge, a plan I had been simmering for years. The shock on everyone's faces at Claudia's arrival was just the beginning of my revenge. If this first twist gave you goosebumps, subscribe and leave your like to follow my plan as it unfolds. The silence in the room was heavy, dense. On the other side, my brother Marco glared at me. The arrogance he wore like an expensive coat began to unravel. He looked at his wife, Claudia, as if he didn't recognize her. His lawyer, a slick-looking man, stood up to protest, but the judge cut him off with a firm gesture. Claudia's appearance was not an irregularity. She had been duly summoned. What no one knew was who had convinced her to speak. It was me. This was my secret, the card I had kept up my sleeve all this time, hidden even from Lara. I needed the impact to be total, the surprise to completely disarm Marco's defense, which was built entirely on lies and false documents. I knew that by hiding this from Lara, I was risking her trust, but it was a risk I had to take to ensure that justice, our justice, would be done. As Claudia sat down and took the oath with a trembling voice, my mind went back in time. I remembered the smell of wood and varnish from the workshop my father built with his own hands. It was a sacred place for me, where I learned the craft I loved. After our father passed away, Marco and I were supposed to run the business together. I was the craftsman, the heart of the workshop. He was the businessman, the smooth talker. I trusted him. I signed the papers he presented to me, believing we were entering into a partnership, but he deceived me. Little by little, he distanced me from the decisions, claiming that I didn't understand numbers. One day I arrived at work and the locks had been changed. He told me that the company was now his alone and that the documents proved it. He offered me a small amount of money, a pittance, to make me go away. That betrayal broke something inside me. It wasn't just the business I lost. It was the memory of my father, the trust in my own blood. Lara stood by me, steady as a rock. She helped me get back on my feet, find other jobs, but the wound never healed. For years, Marco paraded around town like a big businessman, building an empire on the foundation that our father and I had created. He lived in luxury while we struggled to pay the bills. Revenge, for me, wasn't about money. It was about honor. It was about proving that the truth matters. Marco thought I was weak, a simple craftsman he could crush. He didn't know that a craftsman's patience is a powerful weapon. I waited, watched, and planned. The path to Claudia was not easy. I knew she was unhappy. Marco treated her like an object, another trophy to show off. Our Aunt Helena, who still spoke to both sides of the family, once told me that Claudia lived in fear. She saw the wrong things Marco did, but felt trapped. I began to seek her out in secret. It took months of careful messages and hidden meetings in distant cafes. At first, she was suspicious. She thought I just wanted to use her. But I didn't pressure her. I just told her my story, showed her the evidence I had, which was little, and talked about our father. I talked about justice. Gradually, I saw a spark of courage light up in her eyes. She was tired of being an accomplice to silence. She decided it was time to tell the truth, not only for me but for herself. Back in court, Claudia's voice began to fill the silence. She talked about conversations she had overheard, about documents Marco kept in a safe at home. She described in detail how he bragged about having deceived me, calling me a fool. Marco's lawyer tried to interrupt, but every word Claudia spoke was like a nail in the coffin of his defense. The decisive moment came when our lawyer, Victor, now recovered from the shock and understanding the strategy, asked her to present the evidence. Claudia handed over a folder. Inside were copies of the real contracts, emails, and even an audio recording of Marco admitting the fraud to a partner. My brother's face went from angry to pale white. He was finished. The house of cards he had so carefully built was collapsing, and the person bringing it down was the woman who slept beside him. The session was suspended shortly thereafter. The judge looked at the documents with a serious expression. The outcome of the trial was already clear to everyone. As we left the room, Marco couldn't even look me in the eye. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in an hour. His defeat was complete, visible to all, but I didn't feel the explosion of joy I had imagined. I felt immense relief, but also emptiness. The fire that had consumed me for so long was finally extinguished, and what remained was the ashes of a destroyed family. Lara walked silently beside me to the car. She didn't touch me, didn't say a word. The distance between us seemed greater than ever. When we got home, she finally spoke. Her voice was not angry, but hurt. "Why didn't you tell me, Pedro? Why did you leave me in the dark?" I sat next to her on the sofa and held her hands. "I needed to protect you," I said, my voice breaking. "If Marco suspected anything, he could hurt you or Claudia. The secret was our only weapon. I couldn't take that risk. I explained the whole plan, every step I took, every fear I felt. I told her how Aunt Helena helped me make the first contact. I talked about Claudia's courage, how she risked everything to do the right thing. Lara listened to me in silence, tears streaming down her face. When I finished, she hugged me tightly. I understand, she whispered, but never hide anything from me again. We're in this together, for better or for worse. That night, I knew I had won, not just in court, but in my own home. Lara's trust was my greatest victory. Weeks later, the official verdict came out. We won the case. We received compensation and part of the company back. Marco lost everything and still faced other charges. Claudia divorced him and moved to another city to start a new life. Lara and I decided to sell our share of the company. That place was no longer the same. With the money, we opened a small workshop just for us, where I could go back to doing what I loved, without the shadow of betrayal. Revenge did not bring me happiness, but it gave me back my peace. It cleared the way for Lara and me to build something new, something truly ours, based on the honesty and love that united us through the storm. The first few months in our new workshop were like the first rain after a long drought. The smell of new wood and the fine dust that covered everything were a balm for my soul. It was a small place, much simpler than the large structure my father had built, but every square inch was ours. There was no shadow of dubious documents or broken promises. Lara set up a small office in one corner, with a computer and notebooks. She took care of orders and accounts with a transparency that was the foundation of our new life. I worked with wood, feeling its familiar texture under my fingers, and for the first time in years, the sound of my tools was not accompanied by the bitter echo of betrayal. It was honest work, which gave us enough to live well, without luxuries, but with a peace that no amount of money could buy. We were building, not just furniture, but our life back, piece by piece. Still, the ashes of that battle took a long time to cool completely. The victory in court did not erase the fact that a family had been torn apart. One day, Lara showed me an article in the local newspaper about the end of Marco's empire. The photo of him leaving the courthouse showed an aged and defeated man. The article detailed his financial losses and the criminal charges he still faced for fraud. Looking at it brought me no satisfaction. It brought only a deep weariness, a sadness for what we could have been. Revenge tasted like old metal in my mouth. It was necessary, like bitter medicine, but it wasn't sweet. At night, I would sometimes wake up thinking about Marco, not with anger, but with a kind of strangeness. How did the boy with whom I shared a room and dreams become that stranger? Lara sensed my unease and just held my hand, a silent gesture that said she understood. About 3 months later, a letter arrived. The envelope had no return address, just a stamp from a city hundreds of miles away. I opened it carefully and recognized Claudia's handwriting. The letter was short. She thanked me once again and said she was starting over, working in a small shop. But there was an urgency in her words. She wrote that while organizing her belongings for the move, she had found an old notebook of Marco's. Inside were detailed notes of other deals, other names, other people he had probably cheated in the same way he had cheated me. She didn't know what to do with it. Burning it seemed wrong, but handing it over to the authorities could put her in danger, as Marco, even broken, still had dangerous contacts. She ended the letter with a simple question: what should I do? That question hung between Lara and me for days. The peace we cherished so much suddenly seemed fragile. Lara was afraid and I didn't blame her. "Pedro, this is no longer our business," she said one night, her voice full of concern. "We got our justice. Claudia is safe. Why stir up this hornet's nest again?" I understood her point of view. We had the right to close this door and move on. But I thought of those other people whose names were in that notebook. People who, like me, may have lost everything to my brother's greed. I felt a responsibility, not to Marco, but to Claudia. She trusted me, risked everything, and now she was asking for advice. Leaving her alone with that burden seemed like a new form of betrayal. The justice we sought could not be just for us. The situation became more complicated when an old family friend, a man named Ricardo, came to see me. He was one of the few people who still had some contact with what remained of Marco's social circle. "Pedro, be careful," Ricardo told me, his face serious, as we had coffee downtown. "Marco has lost everything. He's blaming you and Claudia. I've heard he's been saying bad things, that this story won't end like this. He's desperate, and a desperate man does crazy things." Ricardo's words were like an alarm going off in my head. It was no longer an abstract question of justice for others. There was a real threat, albeit vague, hanging over us, and especially over Claudia, who was alone in a new city. That night, Lara and I sat in the small kitchen of our house and talked for hours. We laid everything out on the table: our desire for peace, our fear of Marco's threats, our debt to Claudia, and our responsibility to those other victims. Lara, with her incredible strength, looked me in the eyes and said, "If we're going to do something, let's do it together, and we'll do it the right way, with no secrets." We decided we couldn't ignore Claudia's request. She wasn't asking us to fight a new war, but to help her close the door on her past as well. We agreed that the best course of action would be the safest one. We wouldn't confront Marco, but we also wouldn't leave Claudia helpless with this problem. We contacted Victor, our lawyer. We explained the situation with the letter and the threats that Ricardo had told us about. Victor was clear: we should avoid any contact with Marco. He had advised us to instruct Claudia to hand over the notebook to the authorities anonymously, through a lawyer in her city, so that her name would not be involved. We offered to pay for Claudia's legal fees, as a way of ensuring her safety and thanking her for everything she had done. She accepted, relieved. As for the threats, Victor instructed us to file a preventive police report, just so there would be an official record in case anything happened. We did all this, feeling that we were building a protective wall around our peace. One afternoon, weeks later, as I was closing the workshop, I saw a figure standing across the street. It was Marco. He was thinner, wearing wrinkled clothes and unshaven. My heart froze for a moment. He didn't look threatening, just lost. He slowly crossed the street and stopped a few feet away from me. Lara, who was coming out to join me, stopped at the door. Tense. "Pedro," he said, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. I expected shouting accusations. Instead, what came was shocking. "I have nothing left. I lost everything. The house, the money, my friends." He looked at the ground. "I need help." That request hit me in a way that no threat ever could. Seeing my brother, the arrogant and powerful man, reduced to that pathetic figure, awakened something I thought was dead, a hint of compassion. But it was a cold, cautious compassion. Lara approached and stood beside me, her presence giving me strength. I looked at Marco, not at the businessman who had stolen from me, but at the brother I once had. "The help you need is not what I can give you, Marco," I said, my voice firm, but without hatred. "You didn't lose everything because of me. You lost everything because of the choices you made. The only way to start over is to understand that." He looked at me, waiting for me to say more, perhaps offer him money, a place to stay. I offered him none of that. "What you did to me, to our father, to Claudia, that can't be erased with an apology or money," I continued. "If you want help, start by being honest with yourself. Get a job, pay your debts, ask for forgiveness from the people you hurt, but leave us alone. Our paths no longer cross with yours." He stood still for a long moment, the silence heavy in the air. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner like a ghost. Lara squeezed my hand tightly. Seeing him leave like that was not a triumphant victory. It was a sad and necessary ending. At that moment, I understood that revenge did not end in court. It ended there, on that sidewalk, with my refusal to continue the cycle of pain. We did not destroy him. He destroyed himself, and we chose not to pick up his pieces, but to take care of our own. We entered our house, closed the door, and for the first time, the past seemed to have stayed outside. The peace we found did not come from my brother's defeat, but from our ability to finally turn the page and focus on the life we were building, a life based on truth, work, and the love that saved us. The following months were so calm that I almost didn't recognize it. The rhythm of our life was now marked by the sound of tools in the workshop and our conversations at the end of the day. We no longer talked about the trial, about Marco, or about the past. We talked about customer orders, about the garden Lara had started planting in the backyard, about simple and present things. The workshop prospered in a modest and steady way. Each piece of wood I turned into furniture seemed like a piece of my own life being rebuilt. Lara took care of the account books with a dedication that went beyond the numbers. She was watching over our peace, ensuring that every penny was earned honestly. Transparency was the cornerstone of our new foundation. Some nights I would watch her sleep and feel such gratitude that it hurt. She had been my compass in the darkness, and now we were finally sailing in calm waters under a clear sky. One day, almost a year after that encounter on the street, Ricardo called me. His voice was different, heavier. "Pedro, I need to tell you something about your brother," he said bluntly. My stomach churned, expecting another problem, another threat. "He passed away," Ricardo continued in a low voice. "Apparently it was severe pneumonia. He was living in a very simple rented room on the other side of town. They found him already dead." I was silent, processing the news. I felt no joy, no relief. I felt an immense, hollow emptiness. Marco's end was not dramatic like in the movies with a final confrontation. It was a lonely, silent, and sad end. I hung up the phone and told Lara. She hugged me and said nothing, just let me feel the weight of that news. The boy with whom I shared a room, with whom I learned to ride a bike, had vanished from the world. Revenge destroyed him, but loneliness took him. That night, I cried, not for the man he had become, but for the brother I had lost long, long ago. 2 weeks later, we received a letter from a lawyer. It was about Aunt Helena, who had passed away a few months earlier. We knew of her death, but we weren't expecting anything. The letter said that she had left an item in her will to be divided equally between Marco and me. Since Marco was no longer with us, his share would go to me, his only direct relative. The lawyer asked us to come to his office to collect the item. We went without knowing what to expect. It wasn't money or property. It was an old, heavy wooden box that I recognized immediately. It was our father's memory box. Inside were photo albums, letters yellowed by time, and small objects he had cherished. His first hammer, a pocket knife, things like that. And at the bottom of the box were 2 sealed envelopes. One had my name, Pedro, the other, Marco. I sat down with Lara in our living room and opened my envelope. My father's handwriting filled the page, steady and affectionate. It was a letter he wrote shortly before he fell ill. He spoke of how proud he was of me, of my talent with wood, of my honesty. He asked me never to lose that my character was my greatest treasure. Tears fell on the paper as I read. It was like hearing his voice again, a balm for wounds I didn't even know were still open. written. Lara held my hand, reading over my shoulder. After a long time, I looked at the other envelope, still unopened, with Marco's name on it. What could be written there? Words of encouragement? A warning? A request? I would never know. And suddenly I felt an immense responsibility for that piece of paper. Those were our father's last words to his other son. Lara, with her quiet wisdom, said to me, "What you do with this is your decision, Pedro. Only yours." I thought about it for days. Burning the letter seemed like desecration. Keeping it seemed wrong, as if I were stealing something that didn't belong to me, even though the recipient could no longer read it. Marco was buried in a simple grave, paid for by the city. There was no place for me to leave the letter, no grave to visit. That piece of paper became the last physical link to my family's complicated history. It was the final chapter I needed to write, not with anger, but with respect for my father's memory. He loved both of his children, despite everything, and I needed to honor that love, even if I no longer understood how it worked. I made a decision. The next morning, I went to the workshop early. I picked up a small block of fine wood, the same kind our father liked to work with most. I spent hours sanding and polishing it until it was smooth and soft to the touch. With a fine tool, I carved the name Marco into the surface. Then I burned his letter, unopened. I watched my father's words turn to ash and smoke, a message delivered to the wind, to the universe, or to nowhere. I carefully gathered the ashes and placed them inside a small cavity I made in the wooden block, sealing it afterwards. I created a small memorial, not for the man who betrayed me, but for the son my father loved. I went to the bridge that crosses the city river, the same one where our father took us fishing when we were children. I held that little block in my hand for a moment. I didn't say a prayer. I didn't say goodbye. I just let it go. It fell into the water with a soft thud and was carried away by the current. At that moment, I wasn't getting rid of a burden. I was freeing myself. The story with my brother didn't end with a victory in court, nor with the news of his death. It ended there, with a silent act of peace. I returned home to Lara, to our workshop. The wood dust in the air no longer had the bitter taste of the past. It smelled like a new beginning, our new beginning. The months that followed were like a river finally finding its peaceful course after a storm. Our life took on a new rhythm, a calm rhythm, marked by the sound of my tools in the workshop and our conversations at the end of the day. We no longer talked about the trial, about Marco, or about the past. Our conversations were about customer orders, about the small garden Lara had started planting behind the house, about simple, present things. The workshop prospered in a modest and steady way, enough for us to live well. Every piece of wood I turned into furniture seemed like a piece of my own life being carefully rebuilt. Lara took care of the accounts with a dedication that went beyond the numbers. She was watching over our peace, ensuring that everything was transparent and honest. It was the basis of our new foundation. Sometimes at night, I would watch her sleeping and feel immense gratitude. She was my guiding light in the darkness, and now we were finally sailing in calm waters under a clear, cloudless sky. One day, almost a year after that last encounter on the street, Ricardo called me. His voice was different, heavier. "Pedro, I need to tell you something about your brother," he said, getting straight to the point. My stomach froze for a moment, expecting another problem, another threat from that side of my life. "He passed away," Ricardo continued, in a low voice. "Apparently it was severe pneumonia. He was living in a very simple rented room on the other side of town. They found him already dead." I was silent on the other end of the line, trying to absorb the news. I felt no joy, no relief. I felt a huge, hollow emptiness. Marco's end was not dramatic like in the movies with a final confrontation or a big scene. It was a lonely, silent, and sad end. I hung up the phone and told Lara. She hugged me tightly and didn't say a word, just let me feel the weight of that news. The boy with whom I shared a room, with whom I learned to ride a bike, had disappeared from the world. Revenge destroyed him, yes, but it was loneliness that took him in the end. That night I cried, not for the man he had become, but for the brother I had lost long, long ago. 2 weeks later, a letter from a lawyer arrived. It was about our Aunt Helena, who had passed away a few months earlier. We knew of her death, but we didn't expect to be included in anything. The letter said that she had left an item in her will to be divided equally between Marco and me. Since my brother was no longer here, his share would go to me, his only direct relative. The lawyer asked us to go to his office to collect the item. We went without knowing what to expect. It wasn't money or property. It was an old, heavy wooden box that I recognized immediately. It was our father's memory box. Inside were photo albums, letters yellowed by time, and small objects that he had kept with great affection. His first hammer, a pocket knife, things like that. And at the bottom of the box were 2 sealed envelopes. One had my name, Pedro, on it. The other had Marco. I sat down with Lara in our living room and opened my envelope with slightly trembling hands. My father's handwriting filled the page, steady and affectionate, just as I remembered. It was a letter he had written shortly before he fell ill. He spoke of how proud he was of me, of my talent with wood, of my honesty. He asked me never to lose that my character was my greatest wealth. Tears fell on the paper as I read. It was like hearing his voice again, a comfort for wounds I didn't even know were still open. Lara held my hand, reading over my shoulder. After a long silence, I looked at the other envelope, still unopened, with Marco's name on it. What could be written there? Words of encouragement, a warning, a request, I would never know. And suddenly, I felt an enormous responsibility for that piece of paper. Those were our father's last words to his other son, the son who had lost his way. What would you do if you orchestrated the downfall of your own brother, hiding it even from your wife? Comment on what you think and share my story with those who understand justice. Lara, with her quiet wisdom, said to me, "What you do with this is your decision, Pedro. Only yours." I thought about it for days. Burning the letter seemed disrespectful to my father. Keeping it seemed wrong, as if I were stealing something that didn't belong to me, even though the recipient could no longer read it. Marco was buried in a simple grave, paid for by the city's social services. There was no place for me to leave the letter, no grave to visit. That piece of paper became the last physical link to my family's complicated history. It was the final chapter I needed to write, not with anger, but with respect for my father's memory. He loved us both, despite everything that happened, and I needed to honor that love, even if I no longer understood it. I made a decision. The next morning, I went to the workshop earlier than usual. I picked up a small block of hardwood, the same kind our father liked to work with most. I spent hours sanding and polishing it until it was smooth and soft to the touch. With a fine tool, I carved the name Marco into the surface. Then, in a metal can, I burned his letter without opening it. I watched my father's words turn to ashes and smoke, a message delivered to the wind, to the universe, or to nowhere. I carefully gathered the ashes and placed them inside a small cavity I made in the block of wood, sealing it with resin. I created a small memorial, not for the man who betrayed me, but for the son my father loved. I went to the bridge that crosses the city's river, the same one where our father took us fishing when we were children. I held that little block in my hand for a moment. I didn't say a prayer, I didn't say goodbye, I just let it go. It fell into the water with a soft thud and was carried away by the current. At that moment, I wasn't getting rid of a burden, I was freeing myself. The story with my brother did not end with a victory in court, nor with the news of his death. It ended there with a silent act of peace. I returned home to Lara, to our workshop. The wood dust in the air no longer had the bitter taste of the past. It smelled like a new beginning, our new beginning, finally complete. Life, for a long time, found a gentle rhythm, like a river flowing unhurriedly to the sea. 2 years have passed since the day I released Marco's ashes into the current. The workshop, which had once been a place of painful memories, became the center of our world. The smell of sawdust and fresh varnish was the scent of our routine. I worked with my hands, feeling life pulsing in every grain of wood, while Lara, with her calm and intelligence, took care of everything involving papers and numbers. We had become a real team, not only in love, but also at work. Our home was our refuge, and the garden she planted in the back bloomed, a mirror of the peace we had finally cultivated within ourselves. The story with my brother seemed like an old book, stored on a dusty shelf, a chapter I no longer needed to reread. This tranquility was interrupted one fall afternoon when the doorbell rang. As I opened the door, I felt a chill. It was Claudia, Marco's widow. She looked smaller than I remembered, thinner, her shoulders hunched under the weight of things I could only imagine. Her eyes, once filled with frightened determination in court, now carried a deep weariness. I invited her in, exchanging a quick glance with Lara, who approached silently. We served tea, and the silence in our living room was thick, full of unspoken questions. I felt no anger toward her, only a shared sadness. She had been as much a victim as we were, in a different way. She was the first to break the silence, her voice low. "Pedro, Lara, I'm sorry for showing up like this without warning," she began, stirring her cup with trembling hands. "I didn't come to ask for anything. I just needed to deliver something." She took a small metal box, rusty around the edges, out of her bag and placed it on the coffee table. There was also a small, old key. I was emptying the storage room where Marco kept some old things from the time he lived with your parents. "I found this at the bottom of a suitcase. Your father's name is engraved on the lid." I didn't open it. "I thought it belonged to you, Pedro." I stared at the box, feeling my heart beat faster. It was another ghost from the past, knocking on our door. I thanked Claudia, and Lara, with her kindness, asked how she was doing. They talked for a while. Claudia said she was working as a receptionist at a doctor's office, trying to rebuild her life, one day at a time. Before leaving, she turned to me. "What you did on the river, I heard about it. An old neighbor told me. It was the most dignified thing anyone could have done for him. Thank you." And with that, she left, leaving behind the box and an even heavier silence. That night, Lara and I sat staring at the object. Opening it seemed risky, as if it might release all the pain we had worked so hard to overcome. "You don't have to open it if you don't want to," Lara said, placing her hand on mine. "We can just throw it away." But I knew I couldn't. My curiosity and need to understand were stronger. With the small key I turned the lock. The click seemed to echo through the room. Inside the box, there was nothing of value, just old papers, a broken pocket watch that belonged to my grandfather, and a notebook with a worn leather cover. It was my father's handwriting. It wasn't a diary, but a personal account book from many, many years ago, even before Marco and I were born. The pages were yellowed and fragile to the touch. I began to leaf through it without much interest until a note caught my attention. It was about the workshop. My father described a terrible financial crisis, a time when he was about to lose everything. To save the family business, he took out a very large loan from a loan shark, a dangerous man. The deal was made outside the banks, with no official records, just a promise and a veiled threat. My father spent years paying off that debt in secret, afraid that the truth would come out and tarnish his reputation. He wrote down every payment in the notebook, every penny that went to that man. Reading those lines, a chill ran down my spine. My father, the man I saw as a pillar of strength and honesty, also had his secrets, his fears, and his flaws. I continued reading, and the story became clearer. My father managed to pay off most of the debt, but he passed away before he could pay it off completely. The debt did not disappear with him. The loan shark sought out his eldest son, Marco, and pressured him. Suddenly, my brother's actions took on a new context. It wasn't an excuse, but it was an explanation. His desperation, his greed, the way he pushed me away. Maybe it all started as a twisted and desperate attempt to raise quick cash to pay off our father's secret debt and protect the family name. But somewhere along the way, desperation mixed with ambition, and he lost his way completely, choosing the path of betrayal instead of telling me the truth and asking for help. He wanted to be the lone hero of the story and ended up becoming the villain. I closed the notebook and looked at Lara. Her eyes were full of compassion. "That doesn't change what he did to us, Pedro," she said softly, "but maybe it changes how the story ends inside you." And she was right. The anger that still lingered in some corner of my heart dissolved, giving way to an immense and deep sadness. Sadness for my father, who carried this burden alone. Sadness for my brother, who made the worst possible choices in a difficult situation. And sadness for both of us, who never had the chance to be the brothers our father dreamed we would be. Revenge, justice, all of that seemed small in the face of the complexity of life, of the human weaknesses that connect us all. The following week I looked up the address of the office where Claudia worked. I waited for her at the exit. When she saw me, she looked apprehensive, but I smiled. "I wanted to make you an offer," I said. "Lara is overwhelmed with the administrative side of the workshop. We need someone trustworthy to help, someone organized, who understands people. We thought of you." Her eyes filled with tears. She said nothing, just nodded her head in agreement. It wasn't an act of charity. It was an act of construction. We were putting together the pieces that remained of our history and creating something new. The truth hadn't freed us from the pain, but it gave us firmer ground to stand on. The workshop prospered, now with 3 people dedicated to it. And for the first time I felt that my father's legacy was not in the wood or the furniture, but in our ability to forgive, to start over, and to build, together, a future where there were no more secrets. Life in the workshop found its rhythm. The first few months with Claudia were a time of adjustment, a silent learning process of how to share the same space laden with so many memories. Lara, with her infinite patience, taught her our ordering and accounting system. I taught her how to sand the most delicate pieces, to feel the wood, to understand its textures. There was an initial hesitation in her, a fear of making mistakes, of not belonging there, but little by little, she found her way. Her hands, once trembling, became steady. Her smile, which had been rare and fleeting, began to appear more often, especially when a customer praised her service. The 3 of us became a well-oiled machine. We weren't a family in the traditional sense, but we were 3 people whom life had broken and who, together, were fixing themselves. The workshop was no longer just my refuge or our business. It was a place of new beginnings for all of us. The wood dust floating in the air seemed to carry promises, no longer the ashes of the past. Almost a year had passed. Tranquility was our routine, a blessing I did not take for granted. On a rainy Tuesday, when the smell of wet earth mingled with that of varnish, a man entered the workshop. He did not look like a customer. He wore a dark, expensive coat, and his gaze swept across the room with a cold analysis, lingering on the finished furniture, but without the gleam of admiration of someone who appreciates craftsmanship. He seemed to be calculating the value of everything. "I'm looking for Pedro," he said, his voice deep and unhurried. I felt a chill down my spine, an ancient instinct telling me that this visit was not casual. Lara and Claudia stopped what they were doing, silently. "That's me," I replied, wiping my hands on a cloth. He approached, extending a business card. His name was Roberto, and below it was just a phone number. "My name won't mean anything to you," he said, "but your father's name might. He had an old agreement, an unfinished business, a business that Marco, his brother, tried to resolve without success. The floor seemed to disappear from under my feet for a second. The ghost I thought I had buried was back, knocking on the door of our new life. The loan shark, my father's notebook, the debt. It all came back with the force of a punch in the stomach. I invited Roberto into the small office in the back, away from the ears of other customers. Lara came with me. Her presence was my strength. Claudia stayed in front, her face pale, understanding without words that this was a shadow from Marco's world. Roberto got straight to the point. The original debt had been almost entirely paid by my father. Marco, under pressure, had made a few irregular payments but then disappeared, leaving the rest behind. The amount owed wasn't absurd, but it was enough to cause us serious problems. "I'm not here to threaten you," Roberto said, with a calmness that was more frightening than any shout. "I'm here to resolve this. The past needs to be settled so that the future can exist. Your father understood that. Your brother? I don't think so. He gave us a week to think about it." That night, the peace in our home was shattered. The silence was heavy, filled with fear. Lara held my hand, but I could feel the tension in her fingers. "We're not going to live in fear, Pedro," she said, her voice firm despite everything. "Your father lived that way. Marco lived that way. Look where it got them. We're not going to make the same mistake." For the first time, I told Claudia the whole story. I told her about the notebook, the debt, my father's despair, which, in a way, poisoned his children's future. She listened in silence, silent tears streaming down her face. "Now I understand," she whispered. "I understand his agony, the way he looked at the account books. He was trying to fix something that was already broken." Her confession brought us even closer together. That problem wasn't just mine. It was a piece of the past that belonged to all of us. The debt wasn't just financial. It was emotional. It was the last secret, the last chain that bound us to that history of pain. I spent the next few days thinking. I could sell one of the machines, get the money, and pay Roberto to disappear from our lives. It would be the easiest way, the way my father and brother had taken. Solve it in secret, hide the wound. But Lara was right. That wasn't a solution. It was just postponing the problem. The fear would still be there, and so would the shame. On the morning of the 6th day, I made a decision. I called Roberto and made an appointment at the workshop for the end of the day. When he arrived, the three of us were waiting for him. Me, Lara, and Claudia. We stood in the middle of the main hall, surrounded by the fruits of our labor. That was our territory. "We'll pay what we owe," I said, my voice sounding stronger than I felt. "But not as a payment out of fear. We'll make a final registered agreement with lawyers, a document that will end this story forever. We are not our past. We are this," I said, pointing to the workshop, to the furniture, to the three of us. "And this will not be built on fear." Roberto looked at me for a long time, a look that seemed to weigh on my soul. He looked at Lara, standing firm beside me, and at Claudia, who despite her frightened face did not back down. He saw our unity. He saw that we were not easy, frightened targets. We were survivors who had learned to fight together. Finally, he shook his head slowly. "Your father was an honorable man but afraid," he said. "Your brother was ambitious but weak. You are different. You build things. All right, we'll do it your way." The following week, with the help of Victor, our former lawyer, we drafted a final agreement. I handed the money to Roberto in front of witnesses. He signed the document and left, disappearing from our lives like a ghost who had finally found peace. That night, we returned to the workshop. The air seemed lighter, cleaner. I picked up a piece of wood, the same kind my father loved. With Lara and Claudia by my side, I began to carve. Not a name, not a date. I started to create something new, a piece that had no connection to the past. It was just wood, work, and the promise of a future. My father's legacy was not the debt or the secret. It was the workshop, and we had truly set it free. Our family's story was no longer about what we had lost or about revenge. It was about what we were building together with our own hands, and for the first time, the future seemed as solid and real as the wood beneath my fingers. The sound of the sandpaper on the wood was almost like music, a soft melody that filled the space where once there had only been the echo of bitter memories. My every movement was conscious. Every speck of dust that came loose seemed to take with it a piece of the old pain. Beside me, Lara wiped a soft cloth over a newly finished table leg, her smile the light that illuminated the workshop. Across the room, Claudia was talking to a customer on the phone, her voice calm and confident, so different from the frightened woman who once knocked on our door. The three of us were the pillars of that place. The debt had been paid, not only with money, but with courage. We had faced the last ghost and sent it away. The workshop was finally free, and so were we. For the first time in many years, the future did not seem like a threat, but rather a smooth sheet of wood waiting to be worked on, to take the shape of our dreams. That piece of wood in my hands was not just an object. It was proof that we could build something beautiful from ruins. It was our new beginning, solid and real. The months that followed were filled with productive peace. Our workshop's reputation grew, Not through advertising, but through word of mouth. People didn't just come to buy furniture. They came in search of pieces with history, made with care and honesty, and that's what we delivered. Claudia proved to be an incredible administrator. She organized the finances, created an ordering system, and took care of customers with a kindness that captivated them. Lara remained the heart of the design, talking to people to understand what they really wanted, transforming desires into drawings. And I was back in my element, with my hands on the wood, the smell of varnish in the air, feeling life pulsing in every piece I created. We weren't rich, but we paid our bills on time and, more importantly, slept peacefully. The workshop became a refuge, a place where work was not a burden, but a celebration of our ability to start over. We were an unlikely team, united not by blood ties, but by the scars we shared and the desire to heal them together. That tranquility was interrupted one spring afternoon when a shiny, expensive car pulled up in front of the workshop. Out stepped a man I hadn't seen in almost 20 years. It was Ricardo, a childhood friend, someone with whom I had shared secrets and boyhood dreams. But the man walking toward me looked nothing like the boy I knew. He wore a well-tailored suit, shiny shoes, and a watch that was probably worth more than all my equipment. He hugged me in a slightly too formal way, his eyes scanning the place with a curiosity that seemed more like an assessment. "Pedro, my friend, it's been a long time," he said, with a broad smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I heard you rebuilt your father's business. I came to see it with my own eyes and, who knows, talk business." I introduced Lara and Claudia, and he greeted them with rehearsed friendliness. There was something about him, a hurried and hungry energy that put me on alert. It was the same energy I saw in Marco in his later years. After a few minutes of small talk about old times, Ricardo got straight to the point. He had become a big businessman in the construction industry, specializing in luxury hotels. He had a huge project in the works, a new hotel chain that would open in several cities. "And I want your workshop to supply the furniture for all the reception areas," he announced, as if he were giving me a gift. The number he mentioned next took my breath away. It was an amount of money that would change our lives forever. It would be the financial security I never had, the end of any worries. I looked at Lara, who kept a neutral expression, but I saw in her eyes the same mixture of shock and caution that I felt. Ricardo's proposal was more than an opportunity. It was a winning ticket, a chance to skip all the steps and reach the top. It seemed too good to be true, and it was. The condition came soon after, spoken in a confidential tone, as if it were a secret to success between old friends. "The deadline is tight, Pedro. Very tight," he explained. "To make it work, we'll have to be smart. Use a cheaper type of wood, with a finish that mimics top quality. Outsource part of the assembly to partner factories that work fast. No one will notice the difference, and our profits will be huge." I felt a chill down my spine. He was describing, in other words, the same path that led my brother to ruin. The path of shortcuts, appearances, lies disguised as smart business. Ricardo looked at me, waiting for a response, a sign of complicity. He didn't see the irony, didn't understand that he was offering me exactly the poison that had almost destroyed my life. For him, it was normal. It was how the world worked. For me, it was the echo of a past that I had fought with all my strength to bury. That money came at a price, and the price was our soul, the integrity we had just regained. That night, the silence at home was heavy. I told Lara and Claudia the details of the proposal. The temptation was undeniable. I imagined a life without worrying about how to pay the bills at the end of the month, a life where we could afford a little comfort. But then I imagined the cost. I imagined having to lie to customers, delivering a product that I knew was inferior. I imagined the shame of looking at my own work and feeling no pride, only the weight of a secret. Lara held my hand. "Pedro, we already live a life built on secrets and debts," she said, her voice soft but firm. "The debt your father left behind wasn't just money. It was a debt of fear, of dishonesty. We've just paid it off. This proposal from Ricardo, it's just another form of debt, a debt to our conscience." Her words were like cold water, waking me from the dangerous dream that easy money represented. She was right. Accepting that would be betraying everything we had built. It was Claudia who delivered the final blow to my hesitation. Her eyes were filled with a wise sadness. "I saw what unbridled ambition did to Marco," she said, her voice low but clear. "It started with small concessions, little secrets to protect the family. It ended with him losing everything, including himself. What we have here," she said, looking at me and Lara, "may not be a lot of money, but it's real. It's ours. I'd much rather sand wood all day and sleep in peace than have a full bank account and live in fear that the truth will come out." At that moment, the decision became crystal clear. The unity between the three of us was our greatest wealth. The trust we had in each other was our greatest contract. No amount of money in the world could buy that. History was repeating itself, offering us the same choice that was offered to my father and brother. But this time, the answer would be different. The next day, I called Ricardo and asked him to come to the workshop. When he arrived, the three of us waited for him in the middle of the room. "Ricardo, I appreciate your offer," I began, my voice firm. "It's an incredible opportunity, but we're going to decline." He frowned, confused. "But why? It's the business of your life, because our business is our life, I replied, gesturing to include Lara, Claudia, and all our work around us. And our life is built on trust, not shortcuts. What we do here has to last. It has to be honest. It's the only way we know how to work. Ricardo's face closed. He didn't understand. Maybe he never would. You're still the same dreamer, Pedro. Your father was the same. That's why you guys never get anywhere, he said with a tone of pity and contempt. He turned and walked away, leaving behind only the scent of his expensive cologne, which soon dissipated in the air, filled with the smell of wood. That afternoon, after Ricardo left, a thoughtful silence hung in the air. For a moment, doubt tried to set in, but then the door opened and a young couple entered. They had come to pick up the crib they had ordered. When she saw the finished piece, the woman's eyes filled with tears. "It's more beautiful than I imagined," she whispered. Her husband squeezed my hand tightly. "Thank you. Thank you for making something so special for our first child." They paid with a smile, and the amount, though small compared to Ricardo's offer, seemed immensely greater. At that moment, looking at Lara and Claudia, who were smiling beside me, I knew with a certainty that warmed my heart that we had made the right choice. My father's legacy was not the workshop or the debt. It was the choice we had every day, the choice between building something quick that falls apart or something solid, made with truth, that can shelter generations. We chose the second option, and that was our real victory. The time that followed was like a river finally finding its peaceful bed after a storm. The workshop prospered modestly, but steadily. Each piece of furniture that left our hands carried a little bit of our history, of our overcoming. People felt that. We didn't just sell objects, we offered pieces of a life rebuilt with honesty. Lara, with her sensitivity, transformed the needs of customers into projects that seemed to have a soul. Claudia, with a strength she didn't know she possessed, managed everything with calm efficiency, as if she had been born for it. And I, Pedro, was at peace. The sound of tools, the smell of wood, the physical work that tired the body and rested the mind, all of this was my reward. The shadow of the past seemed to have completely dissipated, and for the first time, I believed that the future was something we could shape, not something we needed to defend ourselves against. We were a family forged in fire, and the scars united us more than any blood ties. This peace, however, was a thin layer of ice on a deep, dark lake, and one autumn morning the ice began to crack. A letter arrived. It wasn't a bill or a request from a customer. The envelope was official, brown, with a prison system stamp. My heart froze before I even opened it. Lara and Claudia were nearby and saw the change in my face. I handed the paper to Lara because my hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. She read it aloud, her voice controlled, but I could feel the shockwave in her words. It was a notice about Marco. After serving part of his sentence for fraud and forgery, he was eligible for a social reintegration program. For that, he needed a sponsor, someone who would offer him a job and a place to stay, a guarantor for his second chance. The letter was a form, and in the space for family contact was my name, the name of the brother he betrayed and who put him behind bars. The silence that fell over the workshop was heavier than any machine. It was a silence full of ghosts. Claudia sat down in a nearby chair, her face as pale as the day I saw her in court. Lara looked at me, not with anger or fear, but with deep concern. She knew what that request meant. It wasn't just about giving a job to an ex-convict. It was about opening the door of our home, our refuge, to the very person who tried to burn it all down. It was about trusting the one who stabbed us in the back. The irony was cruel. After fighting so hard to rid ourselves of the legacy of lies left by my father and brother, fate was asking us to welcome the source of all our pain. The revenge I had planned for years had been completed with his conviction. But justice, I was discovering, was something much more complicated. The justice of the court was over, but the justice of life was just beginning to truly test us. That night, the conversation was long and difficult. The three of us sat around the kitchen table, the same place where we had made so many decisions that had brought us to this point. Lara was the first to speak, her voice the anchor of our reason. "Pedro, we owe him nothing. We built this with our sweat, our pain. Bringing him in is a risk I don't know if we can take. What if it's a trick? What if he hasn't changed?" Her arguments were logical, perfect. They were the same arguments my mind was screaming. I looked at Claudia. She was quiet, her eyes fixed on an invisible point on the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper. "I lived with Marco for years. I saw the good and the evil inside him. Ambition consumed him, turned him into a monster. But I also remember the man he was before that. Letting him rot alone, it won't erase what he did, but it might make us a little like him, who turned his back on his own family." Her words hit me hard. I remembered my brother when we were boys in our father's workshop. I remember his laughter, his admiration for me, before money and greed poisoned everything. My revenge had been to take back what was mine, to punish betrayal. But what was the ultimate goal? To see him destroyed forever? Or was it for the truth to prevail? If I said no, I would be closing the door not only on him, but on any possibility of redemption. I would be perpetuating the cycle of abandonment and bitterness. It would be the easy choice, the safe choice. But easy choices are rarely the right ones. I looked at Lara, then at Claudia. I saw in their eyes the same conflict I felt in my chest. Fear fighting compassion. "We're not doing this for him," I said. said, the decision forming in my mouth. We're doing it for us, to prove we're different, to break this chain once and for all. But it will be our way, with our rules. 2 weeks later, Marco arrived. The figure who got off the bus looked nothing like the arrogant man who had kicked me out of my own workshop. He was thin, dejected, his shoulders slumped under the weight of shame. His eyes, which had once sparkled with cunning, now looked empty, tired. There were no hugs or words of welcome. I just pointed to a small room in the back that we had prepared. You'll sleep there, and you'll work here, I said, my voice hard. Your job is to clean, sand the simplest pieces, and carry wood. You'll receive minimum wage like any other assistant. One broken rule, one lie, and you're out. Understood? He just nodded, without looking me in the eye. Claudia watched him from afar, a statue of pain and memory. Lara stood by my side, her hand in mine, giving me the strength I needed. His presence in the workshop was like a discordant note in a perfect song. It was strange, uncomfortable, and we all felt it. The first few months were a test of nerves. Marco was a ghost among us. He did his work in silence with mechanical dedication. He cleaned the floor, sanded the boards, never complained. He avoided our gaze, ate alone, spoke only when necessary. It was like having a stranger in the house. Every night I locked the cash box with extra care. I checked the tools. The mistrust was a cold fog that wouldn't dissipate. Claudia barely spoke to him, treating him with a cold formality that was more painful than any shouting. Lara, for her part, tried to maintain an impossible normality, treating him with distant politeness. I watched him, looking for any sign of the old Marco, any glimpse of manipulation. But I found nothing. I found only a man who seemed to have lost everything, including himself. He was paying his debt not only to justice, but with every gesture of humility he was forced to make. The change, when it came, was small, almost imperceptible. One afternoon, one of our oldest and most complex cutting machines stopped working. It was a part that only I knew how to fix, and I was busy with an important client. I said I would look at the problem later, which would delay the entire week's production. Later, when I returned to the work area, I found Marco standing next to the machine. He had a set of tools in his hands, and the engine cover was open. For a moment, panic and anger rose in my throat. "What do you think you're doing?" I shouted. He flinched but didn't back down. "I remember how Dad used to fix this machine," he said, his voice low. "The belt had just slipped. I put it back in place." He turned on the machine, and it worked perfectly. He didn't look at me, waiting for thanks. He just put away his tools and went back to his corner to sand a chair leg. At that moment, I didn't see the traitor. I saw my brother, the boy who grew up in that workshop beside me. The crack in the ice, which began with the letter, finally opened a little more, letting in a faint, hesitant ray of light. The truth finally came to light, dismantling the lies that tormented me. What did you think of my outcome and my revenge? Subscribe to follow more stories like this.